Thank you. Can people hear me pretty well here? Thanks. One of the things that's been very interesting teaching about entrepreneurship and writing about it over the last 2.5 years is that it's a very strange subject. It's very hard to find a good way to talk about it because what you always are looking for in business, what people normally are expected to find is some sort of a formula where you always do the same thing. You follow these 5 steps and you will succeed. And yet in business, and especially in technology, there's a sense in which every moment in the history of business and the history of technology happens only once. The next Mark Zuckerberg will not be starting a social networking site. The next Larry Page won't be starting a search engine. The next Bill Gates will not be starting an operating system. And so if you're copying these people, you're in some sense not learning from them. And so because there is, in some sense, no precise formula, the question always becomes, what can you actually say about business, about entrepreneurship at all? And I try to, in my book 0 to 1, I try to get at this through a somewhat indirect approach by asking a set of contrarian questions. What great company is nobody starting? The more intellectual version of this question I like to ask is, tell me something that's true that nobody agrees with you on. And this is actually a fantastic interview question. It's a pretty hard one for people to answer, even when they can read on the internet that you ask it to everybody who comes in the door. And it's a hard question because we live in a world in which we think it's really hard to come up with anything new, anything original. You have to be really brilliant to do that. But it's also hard because in the context of an actual interview, where you have to give an answer the person's asking it wouldn't want to hear. And we live in a world, I think, in which courage is in far shorter supply than genius. And what I'd like to do today is give a few answers that I've come up with to this question that I discuss in my book 0 to 1, and then use that as a starting point, and then let's have as broad and free-ranging a discussion as we can. The first and this is sort of the touchstone idea that I have about business in general, is that I think most people believe that capitalism and competition are synonyms. I believe that they're antonyms. I believe that a capitalist is someone who's in the business of accumulating capital. A world of perfect competition is a world where all the capital, all the profits are competed away. So if you want to compete like crazy, you should just open a restaurant. You will never make any money. But you will get as much crazy competition as you would like. If you're a founder or entrepreneur who's starting a company, you always want to go for monopoly. We can have a debate about whether that's good or bad for society, but from the inside, from the perspective of someone who's starting one of these businesses, the goal always has to be a monopoly. And I think that to first approximation, companies that do well are all monopolies, and all the other companies that don't work are in these sort of worlds where they're everything gets competed away. And I think this monopoly idea is extremely poorly understood when I bring it out in all these different contexts. And there's several different reasons why it's poorly understood, and it's worth getting a little bit of a handle on that. It's for starters. One of the challenges is that the people who have monopolies, the companies that have monopolies, don't talk about it. They pretend not to have monopolies for reasons that I will leave to your imagination. And then on the other hand, the people who do not have monopolies, the people who are in insane competition, will always pretend that they're in some way, that they in some way have something unique and special that they're doing that's very differentiated. And so, the example I give in my book of the Silicon Valley company that's a fantastic monopoly is Google, where they've had no competition in search since 2002, when they definitively distanced themselves from Yahoo and Microsoft. But Google almost never talks about it that way. They never even talk about the search business anymore. And instead, the way Google talks about its business is that it says it's in this vast space, undefined space called technology, where it's competing with Apple, with the Android system, and it's competing with Facebook and Amazon. It's competing with the car companies in Detroit with a self-driving car. And no, Google is not the monopoly the government is looking for. And then on the other end of the spectrum, if you were to, for example, leave today's talk and conclude that you were going to open a restaurant, you concluded that you wanted just to open a restaurant, you'd run into a problem very quickly where the people you talk to would not be interested in giving you money or investing in a restaurant. They would conclude that this is a bad business, it doesn't work, and then you would try to come up with an idiosyncratic story of how what you're doing is different from other people, how it's very differentiated, and it'd be something like, well, this will be the only British Nepalese fusion cuisine in Berkeley, and of course, and so the people of monopolies pretend the markets are much bigger. The people who don't have them pretend they're much smaller, and so this fundamental idea gets very, very distorted. I think even in a company like Google, there are it's sort of rather poorly understood by most of the people who work there. They believe it's because it's driven by they're all very talented, and that's why the company's working as well as it is. And so when people leave Google and then end up starting companies of their own, this monopoly idea was obscured from their own employees, and so they end up having had a pretty bad track record over the last few decades. I think there was something very similar like this with Microsoft in the period before Google. The people inside these companies, maybe with the exception, maybe a small number of people at the very top, don't actually understand why these things really work. So I think there is this incredible distortion field that goes on that obscures this from people in all sorts of different ways. If you think that monopoly is the key thing, then it gives you a sort of a very different perspective on how you go about building a business, how you go about doing things. You may start by focusing on you would start by focusing not on big markets, which is what business school always teaches you. It shows you after big markets. What you want to go after are small markets so that you can get to large market share as quickly as possible. Facebook started with 10,000 people at Harvard. It went from 0 to 60% market share in 10 days. That was an auspicious start for the company, and then it grew from there. PayPal, we started with looking at power sellers on eBay, a subset of this payments market, and we got to something like 35% of the 30,000 power sellers in 2 to 3 months. So again, a very promising start for a business. And sort of at the other end of the spectrum, something like the clean tech bubble of the last decade was characterized by companies that went after markets that were simply too big. Almost every clean tech company that you saw in 2005 to 2008, the PowerPoint slide would start with saying, we have a vast market. It's called energy. It's measured in the hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars. And then if we get a fraction of this market, we'll still have a pretty big company. And the reality is you just had insane amounts of undifferentiated competition. And so, you'd have to then beat the other 9 thin film solar panel companies. You'd then have to beat the next 90 solar panel companies, and then and then there'd be wind, and fracking came out of right field, and Chinese manufacturing came out of left field. And at the end of the day, almost none of the businesses worked. And so we have this very powerful dynamic where it's very hard to get. It's very important to understand that you don't want to get stuck in these insane competitive dynamics. But I think it's not just this intellectual failure. There's something about monopoly that people don't understand. I think it is also equally a bit of a psychological blind spot. There's the opening line of Anna Karenina is all happy families are alike, all unhappy families are unhappy in their own special way. I sort of suggest the opposite is true of business, where I think all happy companies are different because they found something unique to do that differentiates them from everybody else. All unhappy companies are alike because they fail to escape the essential sameness that is competition. When the Wall Street Journal excerpted the chapter in my book entitled "All Happy Companies Are Different," they chose to give it a slightly punchier title, and they retitled it as "Competition is for Losers," which has a certain punchy ring to it because because we always think of the losers as the people who are not good enough at competing. The losers are the people who are too slow on the swim team, whose grades are not quite good enough to get in the right school or the right grad school or something like that. And we don't actually think, whereas I think it often is the case, that if you compete too intensely, if you pick the wrong things to go after, you're effectively setting yourself up to lose from day one. The semi-autobiographical part of this that I like to tell is that, already I grew up in this area, in 8th grade, junior high school. One of my friends, in the yearbook at the end of the year, said that I'd be going to the college across the bay from here in 4 years' time. I got into the college that will not be named. I'm not allowed to name it here. In 4 years afterwards, I then went to a law school at the college that I'm not allowed to name either, at that place. And then I ended up at a top law firm in Manhattan. And it was one of these strange places where from the outside everybody tried to get in, from the inside everybody tried to get out. When I left after 7 months and 3 days, one of the people down the hall from me said that it was really reassuring to see me leave because he had no idea that it was possible to escape from Alcatraz. And the reality was all that you had to do was go out the front door and not come back. But it was hard for people to do this because so much of their sense of identity was wrapped up in the competitions that people had won. And I think, and so I do think there's this psychological thing where we are perversely attracted to competition because we find it validating. We want to go. We're attracted to go all through the same small door that everyone's rushing through, and not go around the corner where there may be a big gate that no one is exploring at all. It's when Henry Kissinger described his fellow faculty member at Harvard by saying that the battles in academia are so ferocious because the stakes are so small. On one level, this sounds like a definition of insanity of various professors, that these are just crazy people. Why would you fight like crazy if the stakes are just small? But it's also really a description of the logic of a certain situation where if you can't differentiate yourself from other people, if the stakes are very small, then the competition becomes more and more ferocious. So the smaller the differences are, the more ferocious the competition tends to become. One of the questions I often get asked is this whole question about what do I think are future trends in technology, where are things going in one way or another? And I always dislike answering that question because it feels you can't really give a good answer. If you give sort of banal answers like saying there'll be more cell phones in 10 years, which doesn't mean anything. You can give you try giving more specific answers that are probably untrue. But the general theme that I've come up with is that any time that you hear a trend, it is likely to be overrated in some way. And so all the things that are trends that people talk about, I believe to be overrated. The more widespread the trends are, the more overrated they are. So educational software, healthcare IT software, this is all somewhat overrated. Enterprise software, very overrated. If you hear cloud computing or big data, you should run away as fast as you possibly can because it's telling you that this is just fraud. And the reason the reason that these buzzwords should always scare you is because whenever you hear a buzzword, it means that you have a category in which there are many things, many companies, many undifferentiated companies in that category, and that is the opposite of a monopoly. And so you do not want to be, you don't want to be that 10th thin film solar panel company. You don't want to be the 4th online pet food company. And in general, you never want to be the nth company of any category because that means that you have failed in your fundamental mission of escaping competition. And then the things that I think are underrated are always things that are somehow idiosyncratic, very one of a kind, where there's nothing else like it going on in the world. It's always very, the story you want to be able to tell on the inside of a company is that it's a mission-oriented company where if we didn't work on this problem, it's a problem that wouldn't get solved by anybody else because nobody else is working on it. And sometimes, in many cases, it's often not even that easy to describe what these one-of-a-kind companies are doing because they don't necessarily fit into all the preconceived categories that people have out there. Now, one other way of getting at this monopoly versus this competition idea is that you can always, to create a successful business, I think there are two things that you have to be able to achieve. You have to create X dollars of value, and you have to capture Y% of X. And in an area of innovation, and you want Y to be greater than 0. And one of the critical things to understand is that X and Y are basically just independent variables. Most of the time when you have engineers or scientists creating companies, they only focus on the magnitude of X. They assume that the bigger X is, the more valuable it will be as a business. Whereas you have to actually get both of these things right. And I think there is this very disturbing sort of history of innovation that one could look at, where the truth of the matter is that most of the inventors, most of the founders got totally screwed. They did not make anything from the inventions they came up with, and in effect, they somehow got stuck in situations where the inventions got stolen, competitors stole them, the profits got competed away in one form or another. This was true of the early first industrial revolution from 1780 to 1850, where you had these relentless improvements in factory performance, 5 to 7% efficiency gains every year, year after year, decade after decade. But all the gains were copied by the various people who did them. And then basically by the end of 70 years later, 1850, the factory owners had not made that much money. Most of the wealth in Britain, even as late as 1850, was still held by the landed aristocracy. So even though you had this enormous transformation, it did not actually translate into building very successful businesses. Something like this happened with disk drive manufacturing in the 1980s. You could come up with a better disk drive than anybody else in the world. You could wipe every other disk drive manufacturer out, and then a year and a half, 2 years later, someone else would come up with a much better one than yours. You'd get wiped out. And you iterate on this several times, and a decade later, disk drives were much better, but none of the people who made them or invested in them or joined companies doing these things had achieved any real meaningful success. There are entire industries where it's been very hard for anyone to do well. I think aviation is a classic example. The Wright brothers may have made a little bit of money, but sort of the cumulative profits of the All right, I'll keep going. For a moment, I thought I was in Berkeley or something. So you. So the wow, this is kind of crazy. Well, I'll keep going for a few minutes. Now let's open up to questions and answers. So anyway, you've had entire areas of innovation where you've basically had very little. Very little has been made by the people involved in these things. Aviation was an example where this was the case. You had basically 0% was made in most of these airline companies. If you compare aviation with search technology, search is probably generates about $50 billion a year in the U.S. Aviation generates about 180 billion a year is spent on air travel, which reflects the common sense intuition that airplanes are probably still more valuable than search engines. If you had to get rid of one or the other, you'd probably stick with airplanes. But the cumulative value of all the airline companies in the U.S. is only about 1/6 as much as Google. So once again, you have this very different relation between between these variables, between X and Y. And when there's, and I think there's something about software that has been very unique in recent decades where it has been uniquely, it has enabled people to capture a large amount of the value of what they create. And this is why software has been so powerful as a generator of wealth in Silicon Valley. It has sort of, you have great marginal cost structures, you have enormous economies of scale, you can get people to adopt things very quickly, the customers end up being pretty sticky. And this sort of thing, and this is why I think Silicon Valley has so much of a revenge of the nerds feel today, because in some sense, the nerds have gotten screwed for 200 years. You know, it's not, and this is really, it's not something, something especially new. Let me say one more thing on this whole attraction to competition as sort of one of the core challenges we need to overcome. I think already in the time of Shakespeare, the word ape meant both primate and to imitate. And there's something about imitation that's very deep in human nature. It's how we learn language as kids. It's how culture gets transmitted. But it's also how many crazy things happen. It's how lemming-like, herd-like, sheep-like behavior gets started, how you get sort of the madness of crowds. We just saw an example of that a second ago. And it's something that one always needs to resist. And I think that you have this very strange phenomenon in Silicon Valley where so many of the people who started these companies seem to be suffering from a mild form of Asperger's. And I think we need to sort of flip this around as a critique of our society. What does it tell you about our society where anybody who does not have Asperger's or a mild form of Asperger's will be talked out of their original, interesting, unconventional, heterodox ideas before they're even fully formed, because they will look at the people around them and they will notice, oh, that's a little bit too weird, that's a little bit too strange, people are looking at me funny, maybe I shouldn't do this, maybe I will just go open a restaurant or join whatever the trendy protest in Berkeley is today. And so I think that's, and so I do think this sort of always needs to be overcome. I always like to sort of pick on people who go to business schools in this context, where if you can sort of think of the business school demographic as the anti-Asperger's cohort. It's basically people who are hyper-socialized, they're sort of incredibly social, very extroverted, they tend to have relatively low convictions, relatively few convictions of any sort. And you basically put them in a hothouse environment for 2 years, where they spend 2 years with other people just like themselves. And at the end of this sort of 2-year process, they end up sort of gravitating towards the same ideas. And they've done these studies on it at Harvard Business School and various other places, where they found that the largest number of people then always end up trying to catch the last wave. They try to do things that are sort of conventionally respectable, but probably have already faded in some sense. So in '89, they all wanted to work for Mike Milken and junk bonds 1 or 2 years before he went to jail. They were never really interested in tech or Silicon Valley, except for '99, 2000, when they sort of timed the end of the dot-com bubble perfectly, and on down the line. And while it's sort of always easy to pick on people in business school, I think there is a degree to which all of us are extremely prone to this. It's always the sort of disturbing sense in which advertising is this very strange thing that works on us to a disturbing degree. We always think of advertising as something that works on other people. Who are all the people who fall for those really dumb ads on TV? And it's probably not the case that that only works on other people, or that it's only people who are going to business schools that are subject to this sort of incredibly herd-like conventional behavior that I think we need to always try to overcome. So you can sort of summarize sort of the advice that's always super easy to give is that you should think for yourself, and in practice it's always incredibly hard to do. Let me end with one last sort of bigger picture contrarian idea. And I think that if we're going to have a successful 21st century, it will involve both a lot of innovation, it will involve both technology and globalization. And I often think of these two things as slightly different kinds of trends. I think of globalization. I always draw globalization on an x-axis and technology on a y-axis. I think of globalization as horizontal or extensive progress. It's going from one to N. It's copying things that work. China is the paradigm case of globalization, and it's very straightforward. China just has to copy things that are working in the developed world. You can skip a few steps here and there, but very, very straightforward what China has to do in the decades ahead. And then I think of technology as vertical, intensive progress, doing new things, going from 0 to 1. And I think that, when we think about the last few centuries, there have been periods of technology and periods of globalization, and they don't all sort of precisely overlap. The 19th century, 1815 to 1914, was a period of tremendous globalization and tremendous technological progress. After 1914, World War I starts, globalization goes in reverse, but technology, very broadly defined, many different areas, continues to make very rapid advances. 1971, Kissinger goes to China. Globalization begins once again in earnest, and the last 40 years have been sort of globalization at a breakneck pace. Although I would argue that technological progress has been somewhat more limited. It's been focused on software, bits, computers, internet, not so much in many of the other areas. And so we've had an early 20th century where we had technology, but less globalization. A late 20th century, we've had globalization, but more limited technology and software, even though it's been in an area that's been very monopoly prone, which is why it's been quite lucrative for the people involved. But from the point of view of society, it's led to very different ways that we talk about the world. And so in the 1950s, 1960s, one would have divided the world between the first world and the third world. The first world was that part of the world that was seeing accelerating technological progress. The third world was that part that was just sort of permanently stuck. Today, we would divide it into the developing and the developed world. And this is a pro-globalization dichotomy where basically the developing countries are those countries that are copying the developed world and sort of converging with them. So it's this convergence theory of globalization. But it is also implicitly an anti-technological characterization of the world, because when we say that we are living in the developed world, we are implicitly saying that we're living in that part of the world where nothing new is going to happen, where all the inventions are in the past, and where we should resign ourselves to a period of relative stagnation in the decades ahead, and where the younger generation should have expectations that are way less than those of their parents and grandparents. And I think this is a conception of our world that we should very powerfully resist. And so I will close by asking the contrarian question I think we should be asking way more. How can we go about developing our so-called developed world? Thank you very much.